everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this episode of Listening to Lancaster. I'm here today with Amos Stoltzfus, SoWe Director, and Judge Witkonis to talk about a new program they've both been working on together. Around this time last year, the SoWe board approved that $50,000 of their annual budget would go towards a new program focusing on eviction diversion. And as I understand it, feel free to kind of correct or talk about this more. From what I understand, funds that were being reserved for rental assistance were being underutilized. And so this was a good pivot to be able to kind of redirect funding to a program that might be more effective. So in December, SoWe started an eviction diversion pilot program in collaboration with Judge Witkonis and Mid-Penn Legal Services. The pilot includes outreach, landlord-tenant mediation, legal representation, financial counseling, and rental assistance to eligible households. So with that being said, thank you both so much for joining me today. I'm really eager to learn from you both and hear a little bit more about this program.
Yeah, thank you. It's good to be here. I appreciate what you're doing, and I'm happy to talk about the program. It's a great program.
Wonderful. Well, I'll just start off with kind of bring me to the beginning of the story. So can you share early parts of this program and maybe where you drew inspiration from?
Yeah, I'd be happy to jump in. So as you mentioned, Leah, SoWe, maybe I'll start with SoWe's an initiative of Tenfold. So we're part of a larger nonprofit. We have, over the last couple of years, earmarked some money in our budget for rental assistance, and Tenfold has done that as well as part of their budget. There's a lot of challenges with just doing rental assistance. There was an earlier version of this that was called the Emergency Rental Assistance Program that was during COVID. So there was a lot of federal money that was available, and Tenfold was the main organization in Lancaster County that was administering those funds. Those funds dried up after COVID. We still would occasionally get rental assistance funds. For Tenfold, they would go out the door really quickly because people would find out that Tenfold has rental assistance, and they would get inundated with phone calls. Our funding is limited to our neighborhood here in Cabbage Hill, and so we were kind of reluctant to even market the fact that we had rental assistance, and we're sort of relying on word of mouth. But often people would reach out to us when they're getting evicted the next day, and we can't help with rental assistance like that quickly. So we have kind of along with Tenfold over the last year or so been trying to figure out like how do we do this in a better way, and then we're able to, through the Housing Alliance of PA, they pointed us to some best practices in other counties in Pennsylvania that were really court-based. So kind of trying to strategically intervene at the court level, and then using rental assistance as one of the resources that you're offering to people to be able to do it in a more equitable and strategic way. And so that's kind of some of the background as to how we started thinking about this program.
That's great. And I'll just ask you, Amos, can you talk about some of the other places where people are seeing success with this? Because I remember we talked about that.
Yes. Yeah. And so part of what I did last year is we were kind of, thinking about starting this. And, again, I'll maybe add a little bit of context. Part of what we try to do at SoWe, being an initiative of Tenfold, is identify, some innovative ways that we can address, particularly the housing crisis. So I started doing some research last year, got connected to the Friends Association, which works in Chester County. So they have this court partnership in 3 courts that does eviction diversion. I went and shadowed them at their Coatesville court to kind of learn from what they were doing. Berks County, specifically the city of Reading, has a similar program in one of their high eviction courts in Reading. And then Allegheny County in the western part of Pennsylvania has also been doing the similar model over the last 4 or 5 years. And we're really, looking at the data that they were sharing, really a very effective way. Allegheny County, they have said that only 20% of the tenants that they see and help come back within 2 years. So 80% of folks are, staying housed and not needing kind of a crisis intervention again. So we, really kind of drew on sort of the best of what all of those organizations are doing.
That's great. And Judge Witkonis, I'm curious just to hear kind of your beginning moments coming into working on this.
Well, I had already been familiar with what was going on during the COVID crisis as well. And obviously, when that was going on, there was a lot of job loss. A lot of people got sick for long periods of time. Rental assistance really came in to help those folks out, keep them in their homes during a very difficult situation. On a regular basis, I will see evictions since I've been doing this for 10 years, and every eviction story kind of has a different story about how they got to that point. Um, and when I heard about SoWe and Tenfold doing this program again, I was more than excited to be a part of it. And because I know the great need in this community, and I know what a little bit of a boost does for folks, just to keep them in their home, just to, that's the ultimate goal here, is to make sure people don't have to leave their home or worst case scenario, become homeless or any of those type of things. And the stability that this offers people is really amazing. And so I saw that during COVID. And when they asked, I'm like, absolutely, I want to be a part of this. This is what you always hope for as somebody's in public service. You always hope that not only do you try to help folks out, but you actually have some real resources that can do it for you. And, when they're here, when we do our eviction process, they're right here. So I don't have to just wish people good luck. I can say, hey, look, there's people here. There's folks that want to help you out. They're right here, right now. And quite frankly, it's a win-win for both sides, for the landlord and the tenant, for obvious reasons. But
I think the two of you, by nature of doing this work, are probably more familiar with the realities of what it looks like when someone gets evicted. So I'd love if we could talk about that and then move into kind of what the program has looked like since December. But yeah, starting with those realities, like, what do people not understand about how evictions happen?
Oh, there's a lot that there's a lot that people don't understand. I think some of it is just the eviction process itself. And Judge Witkonis, I don't know if you want to just kind of quickly walk us through like what that eviction process looks like, because I think that's something that tenants, landlords, and sort of the general public often don't understand.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no problem. I think what the first thing people need to realize if they're going through this situation is that it's not this instantaneous thing where somebody's going to be locking you out of your home because your landlord has filed a case or they've sent you a notice to quit. There is time. There is time to help and keep you in your home. And part of the process is basically going through these time frame scenarios. For example, one of the first ways that a person understands that there could be a court case against them is that a landlord must send them a notice to quit. And that notice to quit says, basically, here's your time frame. If you pay me what you owe me during that time frame, it won't be necessary for me to go to court. If I don't get it by the date I have on here, then we're going to go to court. So the notice to quit, if it's not in the lease, that's waived as the first step. So I must see that before I can even proceed with a case in court. And then after that, that's when a complaint is usually filed. So once the complaint's filed, we have a certain amount of time to get that scheduled. It's between 7 and 14 days. That's by the rules that we have to have the hearing. And I know SoWe is already out knocking on doors for the cases that we have. We work in coordination with them. We give them every court case that gets filed. As soon as it's filed, it becomes a public record. And that's when they get involved by doing some of the door knocking and get people in there. And it's one of those things where people it's an emotional thing when you are about to lose your home. And a lot of people jump to a lot of conclusions that's going to happen instantly. And it's hard to think straight for a lot of folks that come in here. And a lot of my job is to, kind of ease them back to things. This is a process. There is plenty of ways that you can be helped out now, especially. But it's really kind of making sure that people understand that process too. So when somebody comes into court, they will be confronted by their landlord, and the tenant will sit in the courtroom. Sometimes that's the first time they've actually talked in a while. Because people, when people are in dire straits, they tend to avoid the negative stuff sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
And, and that's never a good solution. I mean, communication is always key with whatever you're doing. And sometimes that helps. And I will say, and Amos can talk more about this, the SoWe program really helps in getting that communication going. They can act as an intermediary where I really can't as a judge. I'm only allowed to encourage settlements. I can't make too much of a suggestion in any way, shape, or form. I can encourage it, of course. So we'll come into court. They'll have their hearing. 95% of the time, it's about rent. All right. And rent being owed. There are other cases where it isn't about the rent and it's simply another breach of the lease, basically. There's too many people living in the home. Not allowed to have a dog in the home. Those type of things. And landlord will come for those. It's a little different than if it's about rent. If it's about rent, you're going to get what's called a pay and stay eviction. So that gives you more time then to pay off what you owe and to stay in that property. And people can do that from the time of the hearing up until there's a lockout date scheduled. I mean, there have been times when constables get paid the rent right there. They hand it over to the landlord and they're staying in the property. And sometimes, people tend to know that part of it pretty well. Because obviously they've been either working on finding a new place or they're getting prepared for the worst. And if that's the case, the money really is what allows them to have some control, even though most of it is about the money. And we can go into all the factors that people get to this point in their life. And but once that's done in the courtroom, I will tell people the time frames of when that deadline date would occur. So they're in the courtroom. We have a hearing. I have a hearing no matter what. Even if even if the tenant doesn't show up, the rules say every judge has to have a landlord-tenant hearing. That's different than a normal civil case. If the defendant doesn't show up in a civil case, that's an automatic judgment for the plaintiff. So it's a default judgment. There's no such thing as a default judgment in landlord-tenant cases. And that's for good reason, because I'm still conducting the hearing. I'm still making sure that what they're asking for is proper, that there's no other orders out there, that they're asking for, say, a double judgment. I'm still making sure that, I get the lease, I get the things that they're asking for. There's fees in there. All these things I'm taking care of as a judge because, one, that's what the rules say I have to do. And two, it's the only process we have. And it's such an important process because of the eviction part of this, because we're talking about, a basic need that every human being has. That's why I think the law is set to do that for folks, set way before I was here. But because we want to make sure when we're talking about homes that we are doing the proper thing. So, we'll go over the lease, we'll go over ledgers, and we'll figure out if they're correct, if in what they're asking for and what type of judgment is warranted here. So like I said, most of them are about the money. And if that's the case, they're going to get a pay and stay. Now, once that hearing is concluded and the judgment is made, the landlord has to have a cooling off period. They have to come back in about 11 days if they choose to file for the eviction right away. So they come in, they make another filing to evict the individual. Once we get that new filing, we have to schedule a constable to go to the house. The constable then, that takes, so 11 days, constable set up, maybe 1 to 2 days in between, depending on scheduling and holidays, of course. And then the constable will put a posting on the property, giving them 10 additional days until there's that deadline date where either you pay the rent in full or you have to leave the property. So I always tell people the minimums, not to scare them, but to just so they know that that's how fast it can be. And it's around 22 days or so is the fastest it can occur. It doesn't usually occur that fast, but it can. So people need to be aware of that. In addition to that, and this is where SoWe comes into effect with talking to landlords and really communicating. The landlords need to know too that they don't have to file right away. They don't have to do 11 days and they're back in here. They can basically hold a judgment open for possession uh, up to 120 days. That doesn't expire. It does expire eventually, but they can do that and say, look, you've told me you're going to help, you're going to make monthly payments to catch up and everything else. And they can say, look, I'm going to hold off on the eviction uh, if you really show me that you're making an effort here. And so we really gets involved with that part of it too, because sometimes just extending it a month or two after a person's been out of work or whatever reason they've gotten behind is all they really need sometimes to get them back on track.
Yeah.
And you'll find that like I've seen it here now that landlords are willing to work with folks in that regard. There's benefit to them, benefit to the tenant for obvious reasons. So, but that's in a nutshell how the whole process works.
Thank you. And I want to pass it over to you, Amos, to kind of talk about kind of hand off, what the program looks like. I didn't prepare you all for the fact that I would ask this question, but I am curious as we're talking. Are there any statistics or numbers that you're able to share about the prevalence of eviction as a problem in Lancaster? If not, that's okay. I'm just curious if there's any, like, this is how often we're seeing this happening.
Right.
I mean, judge in your court, it's probably around 10 evictions a week. It really is kind of dependent on the court. When
Yeah.
you have higher eviction courts, just sort of depending on where you live, but it's very prevalent. I don't know, like how many are filed every year, but there are evictions happening every day all across the county.
Yeah, basically, I mean, we do see filings pretty much every week,
Okay.
new cases. It ebbs and flows with a lot of different types of cases out there. There are some years where I mean, for 8 years straight, at one time, this court was the largest amount of numbers when it came to evictions. We've seen that tail off, thankfully, but we still are in a very high risk community for that.
Mhm.
Um, so we have to, it's a very needed program in
Yeah.
this location because we do know people are on the verge of missing their rent and on the verge of not getting groceries sometimes. I mean, there's a lot of poverty in this area. So we
Mhm.
have to be very willing to work with folks. And that's, that's one of the things that this program is so good at. So,
Yeah. Well, let me ask you, Amos. I remember the last time we talked, you said that, with the creation of this program, you all were hiring a part-time coordinator and being able to kind of keep the ball rolling. Can you talk to me about, what that looks like in the day-to-day experience?
Yes, yeah. So we started this pilot in December. We did hire a half-time eviction diversion coordinator. So that person has been the one getting the dockets from the court, going out typically evenings and weekends, try to knock on doors, especially because for the docket we get the address and the name of the tenant. We don't get any other contact information. So the easiest thing is to do is to show up at their door. So, trying to talk to folks at their homes or leaving a flyer. We do also, in collaboration with the court, whenever they send out the notice to the landlord and tenant, there's a piece of paper in there that explains a little bit about the program, includes our contact information. And then our eviction diversion coordinator is also reaching out to the landlord, trying to get a sense of, what's going on with his tenant. Are there, is it just back rent? Are there other issues? We are also the judge again has very kindly agreed to have all of his eviction cases on Tuesdays, so they're all kind of on the same day. So our eviction diversion coordinator is there on Tuesdays, trying to again talk with people, do a little bit of an intake. The way that our program works is folks are eligible for rental assistance. We can provide up to $2,000 per household to kind of get them caught up. In order to do that, they have to meet with a financial counselor at Tenfold, and the point of that is to kind of go over a budget with them and make sure that if we're helping them get caught up, are they able to sustain their budget going forward? And as long as they can demonstrate that they are, we provide rental assistance. But it's really the coordinator who is coordinating all of those things. We have a partnership with Mid-Penn Legal. So when there are tenants who have, maybe they've been withholding rent because there are property maintenance issues, or there's other claims that they have against their landlord, we can refer those folks to Mid-Penn Legal for legal representation. I've been a little surprised that we haven't really used Mid-Penn Legal as much as I was anticipating, because as the judge mentioned, the vast majority of these cases are back rent, and typically the tenant, agrees that they owe that amount. And so really it's just a financial issue. There's not really a need for legal representation, but that is part of the services that we offer. So it's again, outreach, some kind of mediation between landlords and tenants, and trying to help with that communication. Because as the judge mentioned, and it's not surprising that when folks, get that notice, they often are in shock, or, kind of want to pretend that it's not happening. And so they're less likely to engage in the process. And we're trying to walk alongside them, encouraging them to engage in the process. So there's kind of some of that's happening. And then, it's referring to financial counseling. And then our financial counselors are the ones meeting with folks to go over the budget. And then they're, again, interacting with the landlords to sometimes we'll, help to create a payment plan. We have that in writing. We get that signed by both parties that, these are the payments that you're going to make, when you're going to make them. And we're kind of checking in along the way to make sure that those payments are happening. So that's kind of what the staffing and the details of the program look like.
That's great. And from what I understand, I feel like you guys are already seeing some really good success with the program. Can you talk a little bit about what you've seen so far?
Yeah, so we are, in this program, we're kind of, again, looking at the best practices and the models from other parts of the county. And the things that we were trying to do is get more tenants to just engage in the process. So kind of starting to document like when tenants show up for court and when they don't. Before we started, I think the judge was kind of anecdotally say that, about half of tenants show up. So we've seen that number increase over the last couple of months. The other things that we're trying to do is there's this thing called a continuance that landlords can ask for. So as the judge mentioned, there's a pretty tight timeline for these things, but before a judgment happens, a landlord can request a continuance to give us more time. So that's a number that we've been tracking. So before we started the pilot in December, the percentage of cases that were getting a continuances in Judge Witkonis' court was around 8%. Since we in the 4 months, the data that I looked at was kind of December through March. In those 4 months, we saw the percentage of continuances increase from 8% to 35%. So we are, again, that's demonstrated to us that like landlords are engaging with us and they're willing to give us more time. And has been our experience, that landlords have been very supportive of this program, very willing to work with us. The other thing, like the big thing that we're looking at, is trying to get as many of these cases withdrawn as possible, and getting it withdrawn before a judgment. So as the judge mentioned, even if there is a judgment and there's a pay and stay, there's still an opportunity for us to walk along, to help a tenant in those situations, but that judgment's going to be on that tenant's record, which obviously is going to make it very difficult for them if they do ever need to move. So we're trying to increase the number of cases that are getting withdrawn before the judgment. Again, looking at the timeline, the period before we started the pilot, around 15% of cases were getting withdrawn. And after 4 months, 33% of cases are getting withdrawn. And we did compare those numbers to other courts, just to make sure that it's not something about the season, or, it is tax refund season when we were doing this. So we thought maybe that would influence numbers a bit, but there were really very little change in both of those areas when compared to other courts. So I think it's safe to say that our intervention has been helping. I think those are great numbers. That to us that indicates that this is successful. It has been interesting in that 4 month period. There were, I think, 99 eviction cases in Judge Witkonis's court. We did our best to reach out to all of those. We only ended up actually doing rental assistance, so that $2,000 that we're offering, we only helped 11 households. So it's only about 10% of the folks that actually engaged in that were going through the eviction process that got rental assistance from us. But we're seeing, the numbers are showing even greater success than that. And I think part of that, is knowing that there's an organization, that's there to help folks. We're seeing tenants just be more engaged in the process and self-resolving, a lot more than we had anticipated. So it's kind of interesting that the funding that we put aside, we actually haven't used as much of the rental assistance as we originally were anticipating, but we're still seeing really great results. And I think that has something to say about just having an organization that is there and walking alongside tenants through this process.
You're painting a really good picture of the fact that there's obviously a legal process that happens here, but having another leg there of community support makes a huge difference in not just the outcome, but also people's involvement and engagement with the process.
Absolutely.
Yeah. If I could just add something too, and just what Amos was saying about the continuances. Then with SoWe being involved, Tenfold being involved, I think that gives a lot of confidence to landlords to do those things where you continue a case because there is a movement going on, and they have, they're both groups are so well respected in the community that helps with that, and the real continuance, and Amos was alluding to it, is basically, look, there's prejudgment and there's post-judgment. Prejudgment, we can do a lot more things to help people out and look at the person as a whole, really. And because, my job is to have hearings about landlord-tenant based on the law. I have trouble doing that for folks because they're human beings, and I know the ramifications down the road for folks. So if things can get done before there's a judgment, obviously a civil judgment, which this would end up being, it can be detrimental to not only getting another apartment down the road, or your credit gets ruined and so forth. So if you're at the position in your life someday where you can buy a home, you're going to have more difficulty. So what's really good about the program is they start off well in advance of that, and they've got the legitimacy for the landlords to really give them that time to say, hey, yeah, I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt here. We're going to do that. That sounds good to me. Mm-hmm. And so the continuances really help with that. And that's so it may not sound like such an important thing in the end, but I tell you, it goes a long way. It really does.
Yeah. I mean, you're really humanizing the conversation in an important way. So I appreciate that.
Yeah.
We have gotten down to our last couple of minutes. I have a couple of questions. One, just to put you on the spot a little bit, Amos, how long is the funding planned for right now, or kind of what's the vision for the future?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, so we use some of our funding to start the pilot. Now that we've proven that the pilot is successful, we have actually transferred this eviction diversion program to Tenfold. So now this is an ongoing Tenfold program. It's no longer a pilot, and they are going to be looking to add another court in the fall. So we were able to use some of our funding for the pilot. We are also going to continue in this next year to allocate some of our funding to continue to support the efforts in Judge Witkonis's court. We've been fortunate to get a grant from the High Foundation to continue and kind of build on the pilot. So we'll be using some of that funding for the expansion and the ongoing programming. And then there's some other funding sources that we've been able to get, joint funding and some other things to make sure that we're in a good position to expand the pilot. But I will say, this program is very effective, and it is a good use of funds for us as a community. But it is expensive, and we need to, Tenfold, and I'll continue to also be trying to help out as I can to try to find, sustainable funding sources going forward. I mentioned Allegheny County. They have, obviously Allegheny County has Pittsburgh. So between the city of Pittsburgh and the county, they provide $7.5 million in rental assistance every year. So that's their budget for rental assistance. Our budget for, the pilot was like $50,000, but it's probably around $200,000 a year per court to run a program like this when you look at staffing and some of the resources that we're trying to offer. So we're in a good position right now. We're in a good position to expand, but as with everything that we do as nonprofits, we need to try to find sustainable funding sources.
Absolutely. Yeah. Anything I didn't ask you about that you both wanted to share before we close out? Anything that surprised you? Any successes?
Yeah, I think the one thing that I just wanted to kind of hone in on, it was in you sort of asked this question, Leah, but it was in your draft of questions before. Sort of thinking about eviction. It is a legal process. It's something that impacts a household, but I think your question was around what broader impacts does it have in the community? So I think it is really an important way of framing this conversation that we are trying to help individual households, but it also is kind of a strategic resource that we're trying to bring to our community. Obviously, as we've talked about, evictions are destabilizing, often traumatizing for the households that experience them. They're expensive for landlords, as well. But then you think about, like if a kid has to transfer schools because they were evicted, the amount of time it takes if someone's going through this process to, go to court hearings and all of that impacts your job. So it impacts employers. And it is, a lot of folks who end up on the streets have at some point experienced an eviction. So really, one of the things that I'm trying to drive home in these conversations is that this is a good use of resources. It's a strategic investment, and by helping someone stay in their home now, we're saving ourselves so much money and so much just heartache as a community. So I do, I think it's helpful to kind of frame this as not just helping individual households, but really this is a resource for our entire community.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was really well said. I believe I can verify this. I think I read the other day that like above 40% of Pennsylvanians are cost burdened with housing. And so to understand that this is a really major issue and that, it's not so much casting judgment or on individual families, but understanding how to solve this problem as a community is kind of the point that you all are at. So I appreciate how humanizing you are about the conversation and your approach. And just thank you both for your work and taking time to tell me about it. So thank you both
Thank you.
so much.
Thank you for letting us talk about it.